Welcome into another edition of Next Level, Inside Carolina's YouTube show, where Greg Barnes and myself, Tommy Ashley, go into a little bit deeper depth on issues and things involving Carolina sports today. And it's fitting because it's baseball season, and it is the heart towards the end of college baseball season. The North Carolina Diamond Heels will be the topic of discussion with Mr. Pat James. Pat and I have sat in the press box for the better part of 3 months watching this team. Pat, how you doing?
Great. Happy to be here.
This should be fun, Greg. And I know you're a true diehard baseball person, Greg. That's what I hear when you're not on the golf course.
This is true.
So we will get right into this. Pat, I'm going to jump in feet first. RPI rankings. A lot of people do not understand them, myself included, totally. But at this point, as we record this today on May the 5th, North Carolina is 34th in the D1 baseball RPI rankings. Tell us what that means exactly.
Yeah, so really, just kind of generally in comparison to, other sports as well, RPI is really just looking at, the ranks based on teams, wins and losses against strength of schedule. And when it comes into baseball, it is the primary metric that the committee generally relies upon, when it comes to Selection Monday. We've seen, there's other metrics that they'll tend to use here and there, but if you're looking for the one that is most commonly used when it comes to these seating scenarios, certainly RPI is the one that comes into play the most. And when you look at UNC, obviously, like you said, number 34 in the RPI now, that is up 13 spots since they got swept in that Boston College series just over a little bit 2 weeks ago or so now. And, I think, the big thing you look at with the RPI with UNC, whereas, yes, UNC, it's in pretty good position right now, sitting there in that 34 spot. But it's UNC's record against its upper tier opponents. That's maybe the one thing that you're looking at the closest right now. UNC is 9-15 against teams in the RPI top 50, 15-16 against teams through 1 through 100. And right now, as we're standing, UNC would be in the postseason with that current mark. But certainly need to build upon that a little bit more over these next 2 weeks to feel further solidified into that spot.
Do you think this is a true bubble team, Pat?
I think at this point, I would say that UNC is closer to safe than on the bubble. I think that this past weekend, going to Virginia Tech was massive. I think my opinion going into that series was that the winner of that series is sitting pretty comfortable, and the loser is very well likely going to miss the NCAA tournament. And you look at Virginia Tech right now, they're outside of D1 baseball's projected field. They have a big loss against Radford, who I think is like 292 in the RPI. That's really kind of weighting them down a little bit. Another thing is, too, is you look at UNC back to 11-11 overall in ACC play. You'd have to think that if UNC is able to finish exactly 500 in ACC play, they're most likely getting in. They'd be going 3-3 against NC State and Clemson over these next 2 weeks. And I would have to think that 4-2 or better, obviously, is almost a certainty to get them in at this point.
When you look at the Boyd's World needs report, which kind of forecast out, what does a team need to do to reach certain benchmarks in RPI? And what they have with Carolina having 8 games left, need 5 wins to be top 32, 7 wins out of those 8 to get into the top 16. I bring that up because with North Carolina on the positive side of the bubble right now, do they have any chance of hosting if they go on a strong close, do you think?
I think it's certainly within the realm of possibilities. I'm glad you asked that because I feel like that's not a conversation that a lot of people are really having right now. And it's funny to have that conversation now when you think back to last year as well, where, exam break, we weren't thinking about the possibility of UNC hosting at all. But, you look at this remaining schedule, 7 of the last 8 regular season games are against teams in the top 26 of the RPI. That's Coastal Carolina, Clemson, and NC State. 4 of those are also on the road, which I think is also obviously going to help a little bit. And you look at UNC, another one of the metrics in its favor is that it is 9-4 in away games this year, including 7-3 in ACC road games. So I think that'll be helpful for them going forward too. You look at, the only team that's not in that, top 26 mix is Gardner Webb. Next 2 weeks from now, 2 Tuesdays from now, they're number 148 in the RPI, but they're also 27-16. So if you were to say lose to them, it's not going to hurt you too bad. And, win there, obviously, you're not going to get dinged by that either, as you've seen with some of these other teams, like Campbell, for example, who's in an extremely weak conference that's kind of getting banged up even with some of its wins over its opponents. But, you look at it, and I think something else that's also interesting about UNC when you look at, those remaining games is, as we're sitting here today, UNC would be the number 8 seed in the ACC tournament. I still think it's a little too far to be kind of projecting what that's going to be looking at like right now, considering how, the middle of the standings are looking. But as the number 8 seed in the ACC tournament, UNC would be matched up Wake Forest and NC State at this point. Wake Forest is obviously number 1 in the RPI, in my opinion, is the best team in the country. And there is a scenario, obviously, where you could maybe pick up a win against them theoretically, which, if we're projecting still, would obviously go a long ways towards helping UNC's hosting chances.
It's an interesting discussion. You talked about Campbell, and of course, Campbell beat Carolina 65 last week, and did so, well, I guess this week, technically, and did so on the back of 2 hit by pitches late, which is that's a rough way to lose a ball game. But their schedule hurts them. Carolina is what they have ahead of them certainly helps. You mentioned the 500 thing. That's certainly attainable. Pat, when I look at this, we talked about it in the box the other day. That Seton Hall loss way back on the first day of the season, how much does that affect y'all's rankings or the RPI rankings and Carolina's situation here? We mentioned we've talked about not sweeping series that they should have. How much do those games way back, Seton Hall, Georgia Tech, Notre Dame, are they affecting Carolina now, or do these next 2 weeks sort of erase all that depending on how they do?
I think it's definitely a little bit more of the latter. I think the Seton Hall series, obviously that's UNC's lowest ranked RPI loss. I think Seton Hall, I'm trying to find it right now, I think they're around 172 or so. And obviously a weaker conference there in the Big East when it comes to baseball. So definitely like not a great look. But I think in my opinion, it's those 2 that you mentioned. They are not completing those sweeps on the road at Notre Dame and Georgia Tech. Those certainly in the moment to me felt like big time missed opportunities. Obviously you're looking at it where, you're trying to finish off a sweep as the part of the second game of doubleheader in both of those situations on the road. And so I can understand maybe the idea of, again, these are college kids, you got the series win already, maybe kind of taking your foot off the gas a little bit, but in the moment, both of those losses were ones to me that felt like could end up, coming into play for UNC in terms of its postseason resume down the stretch. And if I were to look at any result at this point, it'd be really those 2.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic you pointed out there. You get the series win, and then you got to play another game. And quite frankly, in both of those games, Carolina looked like they were ready to hop on the bus and get back to Chapel Hill, especially given the weather and all that crazy stuff that's been going on this season. We're talking to Pat James, D1 Baseball, about North Carolina's tournament chances and all. Pat, what did the Virginia Tech Saturday show you about this North Carolina team? Obviously, Matt Horvath loaded them up on his back and probably had one of the best baseball days I've ever seen, and certainly one of the best weeks of the season for anybody in the country. But what did you learn about this team up there in Blacksburg that maybe we hadn't learned all year?
Yeah, I think it's a good question because, I think you go back to that Boston College series, that Sunday of the finale, we're sitting there post game. And I think the big thing that stood out to me at that point is, it's crunch time at that point. It's like, how's this team going to respond? And just over the course of this season, I've been kind of curious, about the general pulse, the general leadership from it. Matt Horvath is a guy who, Coach Forbes has touted as kind of the heartbeat and the soul of this team. And he's a guy who, for as much as productive as he's been, for as much as he's done over the course of his career, has always been kind of more of a lead by example guy, in my opinion. I never really projected him to be, sort of this fiery force or anything like that. And I was really curious where that sort of presence was going to come from. It really hadn't revealed itself over the course of the season up until that point, in my opinion. But as we came to find out, going back and watching the broadcast from that Sunday game, that's when, Mac obviously called that players only meeting and really sat down with the guys and kind of, addressed that, like, the fact that some brought to his attention, maybe guys aren't taking these losses as seriously as they should. Maybe people should be more invested in winning. And just having kind of real conversations about that. And, we talked to Mac there after that UNCW game last Tuesday. And I thought the way that he spoke about that, honestly, in a lot of ways, sounded a lot like some of the best leaders who I've heard come through this program, especially here in recent years. Talking about guys like Angel Zarate, Dallas Tesser, Michael Bush. And I thought that you really kind of saw over the course of last week, kind of some of that leadership come through. Mac obviously with his play, but I thought just kind of the vocal aspect for him. Tomas Frick as well. You saw him come up in some big spots as well. I think those two guys are the two who you're really looking towards at that point, for that leadership. So I thought for that to kind of come through just over the course of the entire week was massive. And I thought, maybe the other thing that was really big for me in the Virginia Tech series specifically was, over the course of this season, Coach Forbes has talked about the idea of, having a knockout punch a little bit, and maybe at times that being lacking. And, that's something that I've talked about as well, kind of that idea of a killer instinct. It's been missing at times, I feel like, in different situations. But I thought that it was extremely apparent there in the second game of that doubleheader. You go into the eighth inning of that one, UNC was cruising there for most of that game after piling some runs there early. But eighth inning, Virginia Tech's able to work into a situation where they have the tying run at the plate against Matt Poston. He comes in, gets the 2 strikeouts. Then you go in the top of the ninth, first 3 guys walk and eventually come around to score. And the last of those is Jackson Vanderbrink scoring on a wild pitch in which, he dives head first into home plate, takes the catcher's mitt to the face. And I thought just that effort there. I mean, I was saying the other day, like, if I'm the coaching staff, that play right there, like I'm showing that over and over again and being like, this is what it's going to take, to make a run, or these sort of plays right here. And so I thought to kind of see that come through a little bit was pretty encouraging for that group.
Pat, when I look at this team, we all kind of do the comparison thing, right? We think about what the program has been, what the standard has been, and when I look at where this team is, on the plus side of the bubble right now, in pretty good shape to make the NCAA tournament, I think Carolina fans should feel pretty good given kind of how this team is made up. I mean, the hitting success doesn't surprise me. We've seen a lot of Carolina teams, dating back to the early Mike Fox era, have a lot of success at the plate. But what has really defined this program over the last 25 years is elite pitching. I just pulled up. This is wild. Go back to 2017, right? I had a great year that year. When you look at the starting pitchers, J.B. Bukakis had a 2.53 ERA. Tyler Baum, 2.57. Luca Delatry, 3.34, and he was kind of the weak link of that unit. And then you look at this group. It's crazy. Connor is over 5. Jake's over 6. Carlson's 8.9. And those are your starters. So for North Carolina to be in the position they're in with the starting pitching, and that's not even to talk about the bullpen, struggling the way that it has, I'm just amazed. And I would like your kind of opinion on, did you think the pitching staff had the potential to struggle to this extent, or has this been a surprise for you as well?
Yeah, it's certainly been a surprise. I mean, you go back to last year. I mean, it's kind of wild how it's been kind of the same story to some extent, where, I mean, the pitching really kind of hampered UNC for much of last year, especially there in that, rough April where UNC lost 5 straight ACC series. First time that ever happened in program history. But for me, and and Coach Forbes talked about it over that stretch last season, where it's like, yeah, like we're making efforts to try to fix this, like going out, trying to bring in some more guys, recruiting wise, not just through high school ranks, but obviously the portal as well. And you saw UNC do that a little bit. Kevin Acey's come in, obviously has emerged as probably one of, if not the most reliable arm on this staff, along with Matt Poston, coming from the JUCO ranks as well. But I mean, really, coming out of the summer, I mean, I truly felt, and the coaching staff has talked about this a lot too, but that this was going to be the deepest pitching staff that, I've covered at UNC in a couple years, honestly. I mean, there's a lot to like about the staff personally. I mean, you just look at some of the stuff, and I still feel that in terms of just pure stuff, this is the best pitching staff that UNC has had a couple of years, but it has not been consistent by any means. And I think that maybe there hasn't been quite as much swing and miss with this group for what their stuff is, for whatever reason that is. And, I think a lot of that is, there's been a lot of situations where UNC has been able to get into 2-strike counts and just haven't been able to put guys away. I think that's kind of hurt them on the pitching side a little bit. But I mean, you look at a guy, I mean, I know Connor Bover, you look at his numbers, they don't exactly scream ace. But I think Coach Forbes talked about it a couple of weeks ago where you look at this team, and of all the players on it, I mean, he's probably made the biggest leap of everybody. I mean, you go back to last year, I mean, a really up and down year for him from the moment he got on campus. Where, I mean, in the off season coming from Siena, I mean, he got knocked around pretty good. I saw most of those outings in that fall and preseason of that year. Came in last year in the spring, struggled. I mean, started in the bullpen, found some success there in the bullpen. They move in the rotation again, kind of hits the ground running with that, but then slowly, again, in that April came around and everybody was struggling. He was certainly right there in the middle of it. They moved him back to the bullpen though, and you kind of saw him, change his mindset a lot. They talk about that idea of like, being a starter or reliever, you don't want to think too much differently. But what I appreciate about Connor is that he is pretty honest, about his struggles and what he's gone through. And over the course of this season, he's really talked about how much that helped him, where, instead of kind of being timid and kind of, biting around the strike zone a little bit, just kind of nibbling around it, he's really come at guys this year, that shows up. He has a first pitch strike percentage that's up 11.9% to 67.5% overall. That's second in the ACC. And subsequently, you've seen his walk rate, be cut almost in half. That's been massive for him. It's allow him to go deeper into games. I mean, you saw it there. He moves into the Friday night role last week. And although, gives up 5 runs, the fact that he went 7 innings in that one and really kind of grinded it out. I mean, that's what UNC needs right now more than anything. And I think that if UNC can continue to get that sort of length from him there in the Friday spot, that it could potentially allow this, UNC pitching staff to maybe kind of reach its potential a little bit more, where you're not running out, the same bullpen guys, 3 times maybe in a single weekend.
Yeah, that's a great point about getting length. Forbes has talked about that all year. And, when I guess it was Carlson against Boston College, Forbes was hot about Carlson not going deep enough on Friday and basically saying, and it's accurate, that it screwed the bullpen up all weekend. And it resulted in some guys either pitching tired or not being able to pitch because they had pitched too much to make up for that. But something happened with Bover there, and going 7, even in a loss, makes guys available. I want to ask you. I can't remember exactly when I said it to Forbes, one of those post games. I said at some point you're going to have to win a game 3-2. Well, Carolina was able to beat East Carolina, who I think is a pretty good baseball team, 2-1 with those 3 pitchers that we've talked about. And that seems like the ideal setup for Carolina in a must-win type game, which I think East Carolina was. Going forward, Bover is going to be your Friday. Are we set on Knapp and Pence being the weekend starters, or is there some more wiggle there? Obviously, you got 2 more series with Clemson and NC State, but then you also have the ACC tournament, and that's where guys really shone last season.
Yeah, I mean, Dalton Pence has been a guy who, you go back to last summer. I mean, coming off Tommy John surgery, missed all of his true freshman season, dominated the Coastal Plain League last year. I mean, again, Coastal Plain League, it's certainly not the Cape, but it is a good league, a good quality league. And, I made it out there to see him once over the summer, and he just came off across super impressive. I mean, the fastball is one of the best pitches on this team, just has a ton of life to it, plays up in the zone really well just because of the spin rate on it. And the changeup also, I think, is a good pitch that he's able to build off. And, he's worked on, the cutter this year. That was a thing where early in the year when UNC came into this season expecting him to be their closer, and he struggled there a little bit out of the gate. Teams were just squaring off that fastball a little bit too much because he was relying on it so much. But, he's added that cutter there in about mid-March. And I think that you've seen the results kind of, transpire with that. Those two things have really intersected and allowed him to find success. Obviously he's a lefty as well. And, if Coach Forbes could draw it up perfectly, it'd be right, left, right. So I think in an ideal scenario, you're able to keep him there on Saturday. He made that first weekend start of his career last weekend at Virginia Tech. And, I mean, only goes 3 innings while throwing 80 pitches, not great. But I thought, he really showed some mettle there. He allows the first 3 batters he faces to reach and eventually score, but held the last 11 he faced hitless, finished his career high 5 strikeouts. And, I think even the bigger performance that really stood out to me was that 4-inning start that he had against South Carolina there in Charlotte. I mean, South Carolina is one of maybe the top 3 lineups in the country. And you can honestly argue they might be the best right now, even though they're pretty banged up. But I thought that was pretty impressive. And so I think, all things considered, I would see him sticking there in one of those spots. I think Jake Knapp as well. I mean, it's kind of tough because I feel like his overall results honestly don't quite match how I feel like he's been looking here as of late. I think the fastball is, mid 90s. I mean, he's one of the hardest throwers on this team, second behind Ben Peterson, I believe, in terms of average velocity. I think at times, he kind of loses that fastball a little bit. It just has so much run on it that he can kind of, run into some damage there. And you saw last week in that Virginia Tech series where the other thing that was kind of hurting him there early was just off-speed stuff. Just, wasn't throwing it close enough to the plate to kind of get those Virginia Tech guys to swing at it, bounced a few in there and things like that. But there's some stuff to like about him. He's the one who maybe I'm most questionable about. But I mean, I think obviously, for UNC to reach its true potential, it really comes down to Max Carlson and what he's able to do and what role that's in. I mean, you saw there on Wednesday, like you said, I mean, be able to go in there and finish that one out, 3 innings, no hits, 1 walk, 2 strikeouts. I still, while I was watching it, Tomas Frick and Scott Forbes talked about the idea of wanting to get him in the bullpen and, see him, come out with his hair on fire a little bit. In the first 2 innings of that, I don't know if I was still quite seeing that personally, even though, he was having some success, fell behind against some guys as well. But he came on strong there in that last inning and really finished that one off. And I mean, who knows? I mean, maybe that's kind of the key for him going forward. It's kind of interesting because I was doing some digging on, his advanced numbers last night, according to 643 charts. And there's a lot of similarities in terms of, some of his advanced stats compared to last year and this year, honestly. His walk rate, his strikeout rate, his expected FIP, his Sierra, all those numbers are within 0.2 points of each other. It's almost identical. It's kind of crazy. But the big thing for him has been, the home run he's been snake bitten by all season. He's allowed 12 home runs in 54 innings this year. He allowed 13 in 106 innings over the first 2 years of his career. So it's kind of insane just the rate that's been at. His home run to fly ball ratio, it's up almost 8% compared to last year, 18.8%, which is the 5th highest mark in the ACC. And so it's one of those things where, and he's still it's not like he's allowing fly balls at a much higher rate either. So it's one of those things where, who knows at this point, but there could be some bad luck there. Maybe that's something that if he can eliminate that a little bit, he finds himself back in the rotation here in a couple of weeks.
Pat, you started down the path I would like to go now. Let's do some kind of projecting out, some hypotheticals, if you will. You mentioned D1 baseball. They've got Carolina currently projected as the 3 seed in Conway, which would be just a fun Carolina clash with Coastal as the host and ECU as the 2 seed. Let's say that happens, right? Let's say that Carolina is easily into the postseason, but they're not hosting. For this team, given what you know about it thus far, I know you just mentioned Carlson, for this team to make a legitimate run at Supers and even potentially at Omaha, in a best case scenario type deal, what needs to happen? What should fans be looking for this team to potentially reach that potential?
Yeah, I definitely think it starts and ends with the pitching staff there, like we kind of talked about, especially, getting that length in that Friday spot or, your game 1 spot, however you want to frame it. I think that's the most important factor for UNC going forward. I think at this point, you're really hoping still that maybe one more arm can emerge back there in the pen. You have guys like a Nick Pry and Will Sandy, who I know, I mean, they've both been really inconsistent this year. Have really been pretty inconsistent for most of their careers, but have also proven to you that they can come through in big time spots. It's not like they haven't had any success whatsoever. And you saw Nick Pry come in there in that Tuesday game, was able to get 2 outs there in a really big spot. I mean, I know the run scores against them there kind of late, but I thought, maybe that's something you can kind of build upon a little bit if you're really hoping. And I think Ben Peterson is also really coming on. I mean, I've been saying all year that, I mean, he probably has the most electric stuff on this pitching staff. That splitter and slider, according to UNC's analytics stuff plus model, are 2 of the 3 best pitches on the team. He's now throwing that 2-seamer in there a little bit more, and the stuff looks really, really good. I mean, I've gone behind the plate and watched him, 2 of his last 3 outings since he came back into the mix against UNCW, and it looks really good. So I think if you're a UNC fan, you really have to be encouraged by that. And, you go to the other side of the ball, to the offense. And, as good as this team has been offensively, it's kind of crazy to think that, we're sitting here, middle of May, and it still feels like there's still another level to it, honestly. And a big part of that is, my big thing coming off of last year was you're bringing back a very experienced group. And, in my mind, I envision the next step for it be to become one where you take, all that slugging, that home run power from last year, and then now you have a more disciplined team at the plate as well. And you've definitely seen that this year. UNC's OBP is up 23 points to .406, which is 38th nationally. They're 8th nationally and 2nd in the ACC with 272 walks. And, a big part of that has been Matt Horvath and Vance Honeycutt, really cutting down on some of the strikeouts. Vance is tied for 2nd nationally with Dylan Cruz in walks. I mean, what he's been doing at the plate, it's kind of an underrated storyline. I mean, I know it hasn't been quite as loud the season he's had this year, especially compared to the expectations for him. But I think what he's been able to do in terms of getting on base and setting up Mac has been massive. But at the same time, UNC at scoring average, it's up about a full point from last year, full run. But the one thing that has been kind of hurting a little bit is it's 2 outs and runners in scoring position. You look, actually, UNC is doing better overall with runners in scoring position this season. Quite impressively. I mean, last year, 799 OPS with runners in scoring position. This year it's 955. It's almost up 160 points. But it's quite interesting. You look, 2 outs, runners in scoring position, UNC slash 274, 390, 441 last year. This year, 237, 366, 433. So average down about 40 points. OBP down about 24, slugging down, just about 10 or so. So I think it's kind of interesting that, that hasn't also at least stayed the same when your overall numbers are better. And the one guy who really sticks out when you look at those numbers is Alberto Osuna. Alberto obviously had a massive year last year coming in from Walter State, comes in this year, and based off everything that I heard in the offseason, looked the best he ever had. I mean, I know that's a phrase that's thrown around with everybody in the offseason, but even talking to some of the analytics guys and things like that, they're like, man, like he was unbelievable in the preseason up until he suffered that hamate injury. And I think that that's really kind of nagged at him probably more than anyone would want to let on, especially him. And so I think maybe, having this week off here, these 5 days, and maybe that's the key for him. You go back and going back and kind of tying this together, Alberto last year with 2 outs and runners in scoring position, he hit 353, 500, 794, and led the team with 5 home runs and 24 RBIs in those situations. This year, he's hitting 211, 375, 526 with 2 home runs and 7 RBIs. So, so hitting about 140 points worse in those situations. And so I think if you could maybe kind of see him reemerge into the slugger that he's proven he is, I think that will take this UNC lineup to a whole nother level.
It's interesting, yeah. I mean, what were we talking about in the box? It, like 0 for 19 or 0 for 20 with bases loaded there in a stretch.
Right.
So those type numbers get people's eyes, and then you start thinking, well, they're not doing it, but the numbers aren't that far off. Let me ask you a last question before we close out here. Let's talk about Casey Cook and Jackson Vanderbrake. I think those guys, Casey's reached what, 35 times straight or something
I
like
believe
that?
so, yeah.
And Vanderbrake has just been fantastic as well. Just speak to what you've seen from them. Tomas Frick, Matt Horvath, obviously, I love Frick's leadership. I love what he did at Virginia Tech for this team. Carolina needs somebody like that, a fiery guy. Horvath's numbers speak for themselves, and you mentioned Vance. But Cook and Vanderbrake, I think, have been pretty special for Forbes' team. And Casey Cook in ACC plays batting over 400. Just wrap us up talking about those two guys.
Yeah, I mean, they've been massive. I think another guy to throw in there also is Hunter Stokely. I mean, Hunter Stokely, he leads this team in batting average in 338, 983 OPS. And I think even more importantly, his defensive first base is really, really strong. I mean, for a big guy, who's obviously also cut down his weight pretty significantly from last year, he's pretty nimble over there. And Coach Forbes told him last year that, you could be a Gold Glove caliber defensive first baseman. I think, again, that's high praise there, but he's certainly been quite good in my opinion. Maybe one of the better defensive first basemen who I've covered. But Casey's a guy who, I watched him, I made it out to the fall and preseason stuff a lot over the course of going into last season. And as a true freshman, he was someone who really, really impressed me. It's actually interesting that, it was one of the first times I saw him in person was a fall scrimmage in which, he hit a, slow roller that got through the infield and he hustled out, double out of it. And he came up actually injured on that play, hurt his shoulder. And at the time I'm sitting there looking, I was like, dang, that didn't look that great. It was kind of, pause in practice and things like that. A few weeks later, he's back in there, finishing up the fall, comes back, awesome in the preseason last year. Wins, opening day job there in the outfield. Then a couple of weeks later, he's just gone out of the mix. Turns out he had shoulder surgery on that same shoulder that he hurt in September, and he'd been playing through it for 5-6 months. But comes back from that, and he's been really great. Moving to the outfield permanently. He's been good out there. I think the real thing that really sticks out with him, is a pure lefty hitter. He's been great against both sides of the plate, at both arms. He's hitting 320, 439, 432 against righties. He's actually even been better against lefties, left on left, 381, highest average on the team against left-hand pitching, 469 OBP, 505 slugging. So, he's been super impressive, a real tone setter there up top. And I think, has really been a big emergence for this team. Like you mentioned with that on-base streak as well. And the Vanderbrake, just a crazy story. I think we've talked about the whole thing there a lot, coming from the JUCO, the wood bat, only having 1 home run in his time there. And you're really just kind of dialing into that power there this year. Coach Forbes, he's talked about it a lot. Nobody foresaw this coming. I don't think Jackson, he's talked about it a little bit, maybe not so bluntly, but, the fact that, he's had the year he's had offensively, I think is a big surprise to everybody. He's been great there in the field as well. Him and Colby really holding things down up the middle. That play that he made there on Tuesday night, another Sports Center top 10 team play for this team. That was unbelievable. I was standing there down the third base line when he got it, and you could hear, even up there around the concourse, you could just hear it, just the nice little pop in his glove. Like, it was perfect. Like, you couldn't draw it up better. He's been super impressive. And I think you have to be really excited about what he's done. And the thing about him though is conversation becomes a little bit is he going to be around here next year? Is he going to get a chance to get drafted this summer now at this point? I mean, Stokely, the same thing. I mean, I think you would probably expect he would have been drafted anyway coming into this year as a junior, but it's an interesting conversation for sure.
It is, and Forbes talks about it, and anybody that follows baseball, college baseball specifically, you're battling other teams, but you're also battling the MLB when you're trying to put together a roster. So Carolina will be doing that. The Tar Heels off until Gardner-Webb on Tuesday in Boshamer Stadium, and then NC State comes to town for a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Mother's Day weekend affair, and then 2 Coastal and 2 Clemson to close the regular season. Got some work to do, but 500 or better, I think we agree, gets them in. They would certainly like to work themselves up a little higher than that. But wow, a Columbia Regional or a Conway Regional with Carolina or South Carolina or Carolina and Coastal Carolina and one of the other in-state schools would be on fire either way. Last question, serious question. Is there any material difference between a 2 and 3 seed, in your opinion, in the NCAA tournament?
I wouldn't say super significantly. I mean, a lot of those teams do have similar resumes there if you look at it pretty closely. But if you are looking at some of the lower 3 seeds, I mean, certainly, and those are the teams that are most on the bubble. The 4, you have your 4 seeds are mostly made up by some of the smaller conference, who win their conference tournament and whatever. Similar NCAA men's basketball tournament in some ways. But no, I wouldn't say there's a major difference there personally.
Yeah, interesting take, and I agree. Just get in a regional and see what happens. That's Greg Barnes. That's Pat James, of course, North Carolina baseball expert here. I'm Tommy Ashley. It's been Next Level, sponsored by Johnny T-Shirt and JohnnyT-Shirt.com. Next week, Greg and I get part 2 with Anson Dorrance. Should be interesting. I plan to get more than 2 questions in an hour. Greg will do the same. Thanks, guys.